You're listening to Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self, a podcast about wilderness Christian mysticism. I'm your host, Stephen Hatch, a contemplative living in New Mexico and former faculty at Naropa University. For over 45 years, I've been leading a simple lifestyle, combining family life with meditation, silence, and solitary time in the great outdoors. Along the way, I've developed an outlook rooted in Christian spirituality, informed by the world's great mystical traditions, and inspired by the wisdom found in nature. I'll be joined by my co-host, Will Warwick, also a contemplative, nature lover, and religious studies scholar. This podcast is for kindred mystics, lovers of nature, and people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. It's for those who are genuine seekers of truth, goodness, and beauty. And it's for those who want to live a more authentic life. Please join us as we explore the vast landscape of this contemplative tradition.
Hello, Stephen, and hello to our listeners. How are you doing today, Stephen?
I'm good, Will. We've had a lot of thunderstorms here in New Mexico, and everything is lush and green.
So last time we talked about wilderness Christian mysticism and began to lay the foundation of what it is and why it matters.
Yes.
Well, today we're going to pivot to the disciplines that make up wilderness Christian mysticism and why they're important. So to begin, why are disciplines important for us, and especially so on the spiritual journey, Stephen?
Well, it's important to regain our basic humanity in a world that makes us passive. You think of all of the news items and the social media and everything that's happening in the world, we tend to get quite passive in our relation to life. And before we can aspire to anything transhuman or divine, we need to be in touch with our humanity. So that means being in full touch with our sense of agency. So spiritual disciplines that we'll be discussing return to us our sense of agency, the sense that we're fully centered in who we are. And, the divine has to be incarnated in fully transforming human beings. So these disciplines help us to become who we really are so that we can become a ready vehicle for the divine presence within us.
And by discipline, can you give us one example of what you mean by that?
Yeah. Disciplines are things like silence and solitude and an attitude of awe and wonder, simplicity of lifestyle. But I know my spiritual teacher, Thomas Keating, had talked about the spiritual disciplines as being like the banks of a river that channel the water in the river so that it can be energetic and be able to do what it's meant to do downstream. Otherwise, without the banks of the river, it becomes a marsh, which is beautiful in its own way. But if we want that kind of roaring river with all of the energy and life that it brings, we need the banks. And so that is what spiritual discipline does. In a sense, it does something that our culture has a hard time doing. Our culture will accept every single option. You think every news item, every Facebook like, every email, and we're constantly dispersed across a multitude of events and, quite frankly, distractions. So Carl Jung had said that in our culture, he said Americans lack the capacity to say no. So we learn to say no to some things that are good, but that are not our highest good. So just as we might fast from food in order to find a higher state of awareness, not because food is bad, but because we want a heightened state of awareness. It's similar with us and spiritual disciplines. So, for example, we might fast from internet use, computer use for a certain time, um, not because those things are bad, but because we want to focus our energy in a deeper way.
Absolutely. And to add to that, you mentioned that spiritual discipline involves saying no to something. Well, on the flip side, it's also saying yes to something else, perhaps a deeper yes, as you're alluding to.
Yeah, that is so much the case.
And in that sense, what do the spiritual disciplines help us say yes to at a deeper level?
They help us say yes to our deepest humanity, what is going on in us beyond the swirl of our thoughts and anxieties and emotions, what is coming up, bubbling up from our deepest core. And so that would be, in biblical terms, the still small voice, which is both our own spirit and the divine spirit, the Holy Spirit, that is like a whisper within us. So saying no to the noise on the outside it enables us to say yes to the deeper voice within. I think of the story of the Israelites traveling through the wilderness for 40 years. So every morning, this manna, this sort of bread like food, would appear on the plants. And they called it manna, which means, what is it? And the tradition is that at first it didn't taste like anything because they were used to, as it says, the meats and the leeks and garlics that they had been eating in their slavery in Egypt. But when they were weaned from those other intense flavors, suddenly the manna had every flavor within it.
Mhm.
So it's similar with our own spiritual discipline. The still small voice might seem like nothing at first, or just a little whisper. But if we wean ourselves from paying so much attention to the drama on the outside, then we can hear that voice and we realize it has every taste that we could ever want. And I would also like to add that this recovery of agency and our own sense of being able to listen to the voice within us, there's a creative dimension, which is that voice speaks fresh and new things to us. Um, and a lot of the depression that people feel these days is because of the passivity that our electronic devices and the news and all of the chatter work in us, so that people are out of touch with that still small voice of their own spirit united to the divine spirit within. So spiritual disciplines help us to say yes to that inner voice.
Yes, they do. And it's not always easy. I admit that I've struggled with social media at times and, get caught up in the noise.
I would say everyone on the planet has that struggle.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, that too just highlights how important having disciplines are to be able to return to them when you recognize that maybe you've drifted a little much or you feel out of balance, and just having those disciplines, practices as a resource to reconnect, I think is really important.
Yes.
I find the disciplines to be very interesting and also helpful. What we're talking about today is this idea of praxis, praxis, which is about taking something, a discipline at large, and translating it into experience. So it's not just about theory, it's also about action.
Yeah.
And I think that is very important for our listeners to know as we go forward in this series, knowing that, we're just not here talking about ideas. This isn't
Right.
necessarily a theology podcast, but focusing on, well, how do we live this? How does this tradition help us to live more fully, more wholeheartedly, and in line
Yeah.
with our truest self, who God made us to be?
And that definitely involves insights and practicing those insights, not just having an insight passively, but actively practicing it. In the Hindu tradition, they talk about, do you want to taste sugar or do you want to be sugar? Well, if sugar is a spiritual aha epiphany experience, you obviously need to have some taste of it to know in what direction your happiness lies. But eventually, of course, that taste of that sugar disappears. Why? Not because the insight or the aha experience was unreal, but because we are then meant to be sugar. We're meant to become what we tasted. And we will continue to have tastes of new insights, but we also will be called to practice and become those insights and to share them both with ourselves and with others.
Now, before we get into exploring some of these disciplines in more depth, I think it would be helpful for our listeners to make the distinction between discipline and practice. Could you elucidate that for us, please?
Yeah, I think of disciplines as sort of a generalized mindset and heart set and body set that enable ourselves to be put in. And practices I tend to think of as being more specific. For example, meditation and contemplation are disciplines, but then there are specific ways to carry out meditation and contemplation. There could be 100 of them. And those I tend to think of as the specific practices.
So, for our listeners, we are actually looking at Stephen's book, Wilderness Mysticism, as we talk about the disciplines. And the first that you mention is silence.
Yes.
Can you talk about the importance of silence as a discipline?
Yes. There's two aspects of silence. One is exterior and the other is interior. Exterior silence is going to a place where there are relatively few human noises. So, conversation, radio, TV, music, to take a break from those and decrease the distractions in order to become still within. So that often involves going off into a place in nature, could be a nearby park or someplace that is nearby in the natural world. Here it'd be up in the foothills that are just 10 minutes away. And then that leads to a sense of interior silence where the monkey mind of our constant chattering thoughts and emotions is able to be stilled, or we at least are able to have an objectivity where we see it. Instead of identifying ourselves with those thoughts and emotions, we're able to see that that chatter is going on and detach ourselves a bit from it for a while. And the practice of silence, sometimes I go and I'll sit on a retreat, say 4 hours at a time, just asking myself, what is deepest in me right now? What is it that I'm feeling at my depth? Not what so and so thinks of me, what society thinks, not my struggles, but what is the deepest thing going on right now? So that interior silence of the chatter enables that still small voice, that whisper of the divine spirit to arise from within. Bernard of Clairvaux, a 12th century Cistercian monk, had said that the divine is like a shy lover and will not come to us in a way that we recognize unless the stronger voices and the whole crowd of other voices is stilled. And once they're stilled, then it will appear. Thomas Merton had said that the inner self is like a shy, wild animal. You might think like a fox or a marten or something like that, that won't come out unless you are still. So, silence and stillness, which is kind of the inner component of silence, enables us to let go of all of the noise, both inner and outer, and to be attentive to the divine within. We might say that the core component of the spiritual life, especially the Christian mystical and the wilderness Christian mystical journey, is listening. There is a listening for the divine presence. However, the listening doesn't start with us, it starts with the divine, it starts with the presence of God and Sophia in the natural world. I love to go out into the natural world and be still so that I can recognize the presence of one there who is listening to my inner being. Descartes had said, I think, therefore I am. And I think a contemplative reiteration of that would be, I am listened to, therefore I am. So when we go into the silence, it's not just a dead nothing. There's actually a presence there listening to our inner being. And that is what causes the inner, still, small voice to be able to come out and reveal itself. We are listened to. And then we bring that into the world, of course, because people are desperately longing to be heard, to be listened to. So we take that listening attitude that we have honed and developed in the silence, especially in the silence of nature, and we bring that to people. And as we listen, they come to birth with new depths of creativity and insight they didn't even know were there. Just as we, when we're in the wilderness, in the silence, suddenly these depths come alive that we did not know were there. So silence and stillness are very powerful disciplines.
And the listening, that's another discipline that's, a sister discipline as I listen to you describe that. And it's also, silence, maybe that's a noun, but listening is a verb. We talk about
Yeah.
disciplines and what we can do. While it may not be an active verb, it's more of a passive receptive verb. It is a mode
Mm-hmm.
of being, to listen rather than to speak. And it requires a shift of attention. And it I find in my experience, it changes the quality of our being.
Yes. Brother David Steindl-Rast, a Benedictine monk back in the 80s, had written a book, The Art of Listening. Uh, and that is so much a part of the contemplative life. We live in an era when there's so much chatter, so many opinions, so many conspiracy theories, everybody jamming up the airwaves and the virtual waves with opinions. And we're lacking, seriously, the ability to simply listen and ponder and to be listened to. So I think that is a great thing that the contemplative life of all traditions has to contribute to the world, to this anxious world.
Yes. Yes, it does. And, we talk about going out into the wilds, into nature, to get in touch with the silence and the stillness that is there. Yet it also can be found in other places. Not everyone has the ability to travel to the national parks and the wilderness areas all the time.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, that's a really good point. I think it's interesting to go to a place. You might go to a nearby lake, but something that makes the human noise appear kind of echoey and
Mm.
otherworldly. So there, let's say you might be on a nearby lake, just soaking in the sun. The voices all around you take on a kind of echoey, unreal feel. They don't end because people are still talking, but uh, they're not quite as real. And you might appreciate this too, Will, living near the seacoast as you do. The roar of the waves. Let's say you're sitting on the beach and there's people all around you talking and kids playing and maybe radios, but it all takes on a sort of a unreal quality, an echoey kind of quality, because the roar of the waves is kind of the roar of silence, is front and center. So yeah, even going to a city park where there's some space, you still hear the traffic in the background, which could be considered just like the sound of a river nearby. You might hear voices, and they blend in with the sounds of birds. But there's something in the foreground. There's a kind of space. There's a kind of deeper silence out of which all of these other sounds are emerging.
Yeah, well, they say you can't have music without the space in between the notes.
Yeah, that is so true.
Um, another thing this reminds me of too is first the fact that our relationship with God is a two-way relationship.
Yes,
And just like our human relationships, you have a speaker, you have a listener. And perhaps sometimes it's easy, and I've done this in the past, to get caught up in simply speaking to God, prayers of
right.
petition, thanksgiving, etc. Whereas here, through silence and listening, I'm reminded that, oh, I don't have to do all this speaking all the time. In fact, rather, this listening is a prayer itself.
Yeah, that's right. And that listening and that silence, it's like that manna. It actually has all flavors within it. Thomas Merton had once said that when the word of God, that is insight, comes to us, it's less a interruption of the silence, but instead it's like the voice of silence, that the silence itself becomes that word. In other words, the silence is chock full of life, and it gives birth to everything within and around us.
Well, we've said quite a lot about silence, lots of words. Let's move on to solitude. Can you talk about the importance of solitude as a spiritual discipline?
Yes. So many times we are defined by our social roles, the role in our family, what society expects of us, whether we do or do not fit into a peer group. And there might be a sense either that we were needed and intruded upon by so many needs, or that we're lonely. When we go into solitude, we let go of all of those social roles and masks, and we get in touch with our source. In the Christian tradition, that would be God and Sophia, this source that meets us in the solitude. Plotinus had talked about being alone with the alone. So we find that our source wants to get in touch with us and break through the noise. And solitude is a practice that helps us to do this. But the interesting thing is, when we do go into solitude, we also get in touch with the core of everything else. Because at the core, as Thomas Merton says, everything has an inner solitude. So each of us has this solitude. God has an inner solitude. And when we go into that solitary place, we are one with the deepest core, that solitude of everything else. So actually, our solitude is full of the deepest part of everyone we love and of everything in the world. Sometimes when we're with people, we grade against one another. All of our little human idiosyncrasies get in the way. But ironically, when we're in solitude, we often get in touch with the core of who people really are rather than those things that grate on us.
And what I hear you describing is that solitude is something different than loneliness. Is that so? Or being alone?
That's true. Yes, loneliness is a sense of emptiness, a sense that you're missing something, whereas solitude is more full. And obviously, there's times when we feel lonely in the solitude, but to be honest, for me, most of the time in solitude, I find it's quite full because the divine voice is speaking more clearly, and all of the plants and animals and landscape features are also speaking. We're in a community that is far from empty.
Is it possible to practice solitude with others? For example, I know you go on hiking and camping trips with your family. Are you able to practice solitude even when there's others around you?
Yes, I remember going on a hike with my youngest daughter, Holly, and I said to her at some point on the hike, it was in one of the canyons of Utah, so why don't we just practice some silence here for a few minutes? And she said, Dad, that's what we always do. So you just sort of fall into a rhythm, especially with people with whom you're comfortable, where you have times of quiet. My wife and I, Joanne, we do that all the time. We hike, maybe we talk, and then we get to a certain overlook or a lake, and then we are quiet, and there's a sense of solitude there that we each read, rest on the ground, journal. So there's a solitude and togetherness. And I might point out that I've discovered living in a family of women that sometimes utter solitude of being alone is a scary thing, because I think sometimes we as men, we just take it for granted that we're going to be safe when we're alone somewhere. But it's a very different experience sometimes for women. So I think that it is important to realize solitude can involve being with another person in silence, where you decide to have a period where you're not talking to each other, or you could have a dog with you. Uh, but a key is that you are able to feel safe and held. So whatever contributes to that, I think is important.
And solitude isn't something that's just for introverts, and neither is the contemplative life at large, right?
That's correct. One of my best friends, who is what she calls an urban hermit, says, well, Stephen, I'm actually an extrovert. I love people, but I need solitude more than ever. And I think for those who are more extrovert, it's helpful to realize that you'll have more to give others when you've had your time alone. Bernard of Clairvaux said that it's important to be like a reservoir. He was contrasting a canal and a reservoir. He says a canal is constantly giving out what it receives, and it can get exhausted. However, a reservoir is able to hold water and then give out of that abundance. So, solitude enables us to develop a reservoir of presence, of insight, of groundedness, so that we're able to give out of abundance instead of out of depletion.
That is so important to hear in our times today, with so much that's going on in the world and how many of us can get caught up in all our responsibilities, work, personal, and otherwise.
Yes. And along with that, of course, goes another discipline, meditation and contemplation, which are akin to the silence and solitude. And I want to be sure we bring those up right away, because they are one of the most important disciplines of the spiritual journey. We tend to identify with our thoughts and emotions and with the chatter, and we think that the spiritual life is going to be found on that level. But fundamentally, it's a much deeper level. So, in any tradition, including Wilderness Christian Mysticism, meditation and contemplation are a way of letting go of and detaching from that flow of thoughts and emotions to discover what is bigger than it and what is beneath it. My spiritual teacher, Thomas Keating, used to talk about a harbor, say in Hong Kong, where there is a whole bunch of boats together in that harbor, and you could actually step from boat to boat without ever getting wet. So the boats are like our thoughts, but underneath it all the time is the harbor, the water. So there's nothing wrong with the boats, there's nothing wrong with the thoughts, but if you want to live a spiritual life, you want to get in touch with what is deeper. So you allow the boats to spread out. You allow the thoughts to have space between them, and boop, up comes the water. So you're able to get in touch with that. So basically, in meditation and contemplation, we want to go to the place that the divine dwells. Dionysius, the Areopagite in the 6th century, he was a Syrian monk, had said, even though we may not be able to describe the essence of the divine, the essence of God, we can go to the place where God is, the place where the divine is, and melt ourselves into the embrace of that divine presence. I think of the chief places where the divine is present would be in a kind of spacious mindset, spaciousness, and in depth. A lot of the mystics have talked about the inner canyon and the inner abyss. So it's as though the stars are shining above a canyon rim, and those are our thoughts, and we descend into the canyon. So we're in the place where the divine dwells like a magnet at the bottom of that canyon, drawing us ever more deeply. Or in other types of meditation, it's as though we are the sky, and we just let go and allow ourselves, our boundaries to sort of dissolve a bit. And instead of identifying with the clouds in the sky, which are like our thoughts, we become that wide open sky again, which is the place of the divine. That's not to say that we're going to experience the divine as one more cloud that's in that space, but we're going to find that wider place that we rest back into, the place of the divine, the place of God. That's what Edward Abbey had said. He considered himself not a theist. He called himself an eartheist, but he said the desert is the locus Dei, the place of God. So we go into that place and expand to become that wide open inner desert, to become that canyon, to become that ocean, that sky. And in that place, we will discover the divine presence within the space, within the depth. So that requires a certain amount of letting go of thoughts and emotions, which we usually think of as ourselves. But actually, there's something in us much deeper and much wider than those. So I think that meditation and contemplation are one of the chief disciplines that enable us to develop the spiritual life.
I agree with you fully that they are two very important disciplines. And perhaps the reason we started with solitude and silence is because those are two disciplines that help to create an environment for meditation and contemplation to occur.
Absolutely.
We're using these two terms, meditation and contemplation. Is there any distinction between the two? What do we mean by these two words?
Yes, this is a good point. In the East, meditation generally means letting go of the thoughts to enter the silence, and contemplation means sort of chewing on and pondering insights. In the Christian mystical tradition and also in wilderness Christian mysticism, they have almost the exact opposite meaning. So here, meditation is kind of chewing on. The early monastic tradition called it ruminating, ruminatio, the Latin word, ruminating, chewing on insights. And contemplation then involves resting in the presence of the one who is within those insights. So, but we get lazy here in the West, and when we are talking about contemplation, we often say meditation because in our popular culture, people understand what we mean.
Another discipline that's important for wilderness Christian mysticism is simplicity. Another S to throw into the mix.
Yes.
Could you speak to us more about the importance of a simple lifestyle?
A simple lifestyle puts space between all of the various tasks that we have to engage in our lives, and it tries to minimize them so that we can give our attention to the precious few things that are most important to us. My daughter, once I asked her when she was a teenager, so you've heard a lot about the contemplative life and you've been raised in it. What is it that you would say the contemplative life is? And she said, well, Dad, that is when you sit together at the dinner table and you don't have a TV on, you don't have music on, you don't have a radio on, nobody's on their phone or internet, but you're really listening to each other. And I thought, what a wise way to talk about the contemplative life. So a simple lifestyle would take things one at a time instead of having a whole welter of different activities going on at the same time. You're really present to yourself, to your deepest core, and to one another and to the environment around you. So that means reducing the number of activities. I remember when we were raising our two daughters, we told them, okay, well, you can choose one after school activity to be involved in. That way we can really focus on that and we're not just running all over the place with several things. Let's say a sport and choir and band. And so for a time, they chose a sport. Softball, I think we had at one time, ice skating at another, and then they were in choir at another time and band and another. They were able to fully devote their attention to those and get good at them. And we as a family weren't just running all over the place constantly after school and on the weekends. It enabled us to have more quality time together. So a simple lifestyle limits the number of activities. A simple lifestyle also focuses on not having to have too many possessions that then might break, that you have to have fixed, that your attention is going to, not having too many devices. It's kind of a humorous story. When cell phones first came out, my oldest daughter wanted one. And I was like, oh, Crystal, that's going to make your life so much more complicated. You're going to be on this phone all the time. She said, oh, Dad, I can decide when to use it or not. So we went to the store. I can't remember who it was then. It wasn't Verizon. It was somebody else. And who should be the salesperson to sign us up but a woman with a shaved head who was a Zen Buddhist. And so she calmed my fears. And so we ended up with that cell phone. And Crystal learned how to use it in a way that she wasn't on it all the time.
That's a funny story.
Yeah.
And again, this discipline of simplicity again frees us up to say yes to those deeper parts of ourselves or wherever the spirit might be leading us.
That is so true. It might be no on one level, but it opens us up to a much deeper yes.
So, one quote that comes to mind as we're having this conversation is from Socrates, who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And perhaps we could say the same about discipline. The undisciplined life is not worth living or not as meaningful.
Yes, that's really true.
And another discipline you talk about is journaling. And I think that discipline also speaks to the element of reflection and why that's important.
Ah, I love journaling. I'd say my journal is my best friend. I like to have a journal that has a beautiful cover that is bound, so it's like it's a book. And I use one that's a John Muir journal. It has his picture on the front, and it's got some quotes within it, but lots of blank pages. I like to go to a place and maybe read a bit and then open my journal. And sometimes I will have read something that I want to record in the journal, a quote or an insight that came. And then I like to record what's going on at the time in my inner life. And generally, I'm recording the insights or the aha experiences that arise as though in an altered state of consciousness, because I find when I go out into the wilds, oftentimes I get into an altered state. And the journal enables me to write those down, write passages down, and put them in a place where they're kind of solidified. I tend to think of a journal as a kind of Bible of the insights that the Spirit reveals within us, insights, aha moments that are revealed within the silence, within the solitude, that we can then return to. Because what happens is after we leave the beautiful setting, wildflower meadow, lake, mountaintop, city park, wherever it might be, then we say, what was that I saw when I was in that beautiful place? I can't remember it, because you return to your ordinary, everyday state of awareness. But when you have your journal, you can return to it and go, oh, that's right. I see what I was thinking. And then you might go back to the journal and then have some further insights and that sort of thing. But it's really, see the journal as a sacred scripture in which our insights are recorded. In addition, the journal also can become a place where we confide our feelings at the moment. Sometimes you might come to your journal and there is an insight, there's grief, there's longing, there's frustration, there's anger. It's also a place to record those, and it's kind of a catharsis in a way. You put it down on paper, and then maybe you're able to let go of those sorts of things. So it's not all about insight. Also, it's a certain catharsis of the emotions and thoughts that might be going through our mind and heart at the time.
One thing I've wondered about is the genesis of journaling. How do you connect that to the Christian contemplative tradition, or where did this discipline come from? And how did you begin to integrate it as part of your rhythm as a wilderness mystic?
It's been around a long time. I think maybe St. Augustine in his Confessions could have been one of the first journalers. Uh, but it's developed through the years. Thoreau, oh my golly, he's got huge volumes of journal entries. It's something that has developed over the generations. I think that sometimes we get insights into the deepest core of a writer or a certain spiritual person through their journals. Thomas Merton is certainly one example of that, but it's something that's been around for a very long time.
Let's now take a look at faith, what that is, and how we practice that as a discipline.
Yeah. Oftentimes people have been raised to think that faith is trust in someone else's insights, say in a scripture, or someone else's experience, or the teachings of a church or sangha or synagogue, something that's outside of you that you have faith in because, oh, somebody else is a spiritual authority and I'm not. For the wilderness Christian mystic, that is not the case. Faith is a faith in what the Spirit has revealed to you through insight, through that epiphany, aha experience. Because what happens is you have an aha experience, an epiphany, an insight, and you record that in your journal, let's say. But the general tenor of the spiritual life is that that insight gradually disappears. And you go, where did it go? What happened? Is it not true? But that is just the way the spiritual life is meant to go, because what happens is after the insight is revealed to you and you're excited about it, it revolutionizes your mind and heart. You are then meant to practice that insight. That is to bring that insight up and to ponder it and maybe make a prayer phrase or mantra out of it and go throughout your day and actually practice it, uh, to act as if you could feel it as being true. And that is being the sugar rather than just tasting the sugar. The journal is full of tastes of sugar or honey, and faith is the ability and the practice of being that honey and that sugar. There's a verse in Hebrews that says, faith is the evidence of things unseen. Why is it unseen? It's unseen because at the moment you can't remember what was that insight. Why was I so excited? So you practice it, and when you do, there is a new level of insight that's able to come. John of the Cross called this, of course, the dark night of the soul. The dark night is simply that the spiritual consolation seems to dissipate, and so then you're called to practice what you saw. So faith is a very intimate kind of discipline that is not at all oriented toward an external authority.
And when we speak about faith, there's that element of trust, trusting that the insight is still there or what you experienced was still true to some extent, and trusting that God or the Holy Spirit will guide you forward to where you're supposed to be.
Yes, and trusting in your own ability to hear and to receive the insight. In other words, that you are trustworthy enough that the divine presence uh, will give you that insight.
You've spoken about journaling and as a place to record your insights. And that itself is a discipline that you speak about, gathering fragments of goodness scattered throughout the world.
So, yeah, one of the spiritual disciplines is the ability to gather the goodness that we find scattered throughout the world. As all of us know, life is filled with suffering, with things that are difficult and challenging. And it's as though moments of epiphany or insight or goodness often appear scattered. They might just appear to be a few moments in the day. And that is not something to bemoan. Rather, it's that enables our creativity to spring into action. So we might imagine that loving and truthful acts and perceptions are spread out across the world, often diluted by a human milieu that seems unloving and by natural disasters which challenge our quest for meaning. But as contemplatives, we're called to gather these acts, gather these insights together, and concentrate them. And I love this metaphor, just as the cold does when it forms ice and snow crystals from molecules that are spread out across the atmosphere. So they're dissipated in the atmosphere, but then the cold enables them to condense into raindrops or into snow. So Rumi reminds us that when something is visible, it's because of what he calls concentration. He says that the breath in the hot weather can't be seen, but in the cold it can. So he says cold concentrates it. He says a prophet's duty is to concentrate and so manifest the splendor of God. And Thoreau also, he talks about this similar process in terms of simplicity. And he refers to himself, but also could apply to any of us. He talks about the crystallization of love in the world. So he says, by poverty, that's interior simplicity, and the fewness of incidents, I am solidified and crystallized as a vapor or liquid by the cold. So, this is quite a task that we have to gather together all of the fragments of the world and to form like an ice crystal, like a beautiful snow crystal. Or you might think of the distillation process, where a certain essence, let's say spruce, perhaps the spruce needles are boiled, and then there's a certain essence that crystallizes from the needle, and those are gathered together in order to make an elixir. So, this is a great task in life that we're given by the very fact that acts of goodness, insights may seem to be few and far between. This is what stimulates our creativity.
You mentioned metaphor there, and that's something we're going to have to dive into in a later episode.
Yes, huge part of wilderness Christian mysticism and the poetic approach to life.
We've explored a handful of disciplines today, and maybe some of them are individualistic in nature, but that's not what the Christian life or the mystic life is all about. Another
Right.
important discipline is service. What does that mean for a wilderness Christian mystic? How does service appear in this type of discipline?
Well, we could say it this way: we only can remain that river if we give out the water that has come from upstream. Uh, it's fine to become a lake or a reservoir, but eventually we want to become the canal. We want to become the river that is able to bless everyone around us. I found this, Will, in teaching. Sometimes I would come to a class and not be very inspired. and wondered, how am I going to get through this? But I simply give out what I know, whatever small insight that might be in the moment. And then the moment I give it out to students, lo and behold, more comes from upstream. So you have to give out in order to receive. There tend to be some times when it's all receiving, like when you're on retreat. But eventually, you need to give it out because that's just the natural movement of the river that you give to all downstream. And that, of course, enables the water to go to the sea, which then will vaporize and eventually snow and rain on the mountains and come back. So it's like the hydrologic cycle. So service isn't just a should, it's just a natural cycle. Jesus says, give and you will receive, and so it's not this sort of moralistic sort of thing. It's a metaphysical principle. It's like a seamless cycle with no breaks in it. And the more you give, the more it returns back in this kind of circle of the spiritual life. And so the two are really dependent on one another, the giving and the receiving. They're just two different sides of the same act.
That is so beautiful, and it resonates so profoundly for me to hear you describe that. One, as a former student of yours in class, and to be the recipient of some of that grace. But also, it's very encouraging for me as someone who aspires to teach. Also, I think, you know, you're right that it's not a matter of, oh, we should give or we should be of service. Because as we spend time with these disciplines and we draw nearer to God and nearer to Christ, we become more like that. And God's nature is self emptying, it is mercy, it is
Yes.
love that is given freely. And I find for myself that, yeah, that just tends to happen more organically when I keep with these disciplines.
Yes, we're like an overflowing fountain. The fountain fills up, but then it can't help but overflow. Brother David Steindl-Rast had talked about it this way, and he related it, by the way, to simplicity. He said, if you keep the container small, it fills up quicker and is able to overflow this beautiful sparkling, water, as he talked about. If the container is huge, i.e., we have so many needs and I need more and more and more and more, it never overflows. So we don't get that beautiful fountain. So, yeah, being a fountain, John Muir talked about God as this fountain. In fact, he made up a verb, says that we're fountainized by the divine presence. And that's what we're meant to be. We are filled and then we just overflow to everyone around us. Sometimes you go through the day and you meet people that are just radiant, and that radiance, their face lights up, and then everyone around them lights up. They didn't decide to do service. They just were who they were. And their radiance just, I was at a coffee shop the other day. There was this one woman who was just radiant and calling every woman beautiful and every man handsome. And just, she served the coffee and it just made everybody happy.
That's so lovely to hear.
Yeah.
And while we're playing with this metaphor of the river, I think it's a good way to frame this whole conversation too, because it's the disciplines that make up the riverbank that you talked about before, and that allows God's love to begin to flow through us.
Yes. Into us and then through us. Yeah, the other metaphor that's used by many Native Americans is that we're a hollow bone. We empty so that the Spirit can flow into and through us to others, because ultimately we're part of a wide web of creatures. We can't just bottle everything up into ourselves because we're part of a much wider web. So it's just in the nature of things. Again, it's not a should, it's in the nature of things that whatever we receive, when we're like a hollow bone, will then be given to others.
So beautiful and so rich to think about. I want to thank you for sharing with us about all these disciplines today. I hope our listeners will find this to be helpful and help them to see that this tradition is not just about theory, it's also about action.
Absolutely.
And I hope they can begin to get a taste of how this spiritual tradition might be able to help them.
Absolutely.
So, Stephen, I wish you well, and I look forward to our next conversation.
I will as well, Will. Dear friends and listeners, we've come to the end of this episode of Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by liking, commenting, and sharing this episode with others. If you have a question you would like answered, are interested in learning more about a topic, or would like to pursue one-on-one spiritual direction with either of us, you can write to us at natureasbeloved@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at natureasbeloved. For daily photos and quotes, you can follow Stephen on Facebook or Instagram at the Stephen Hatch Outlook. And for more information about Stephen's books, you can find them on Stephen K. Hatch's Amazon author page. Until next time, may you continue to walk in beauty, be well, and stay wild.